Naming a character is often the first part of actually creating a character. There are many strategies you can use here, and they can help add a certain level of depth to your character or act as a sort of genius bonus or even a bilingual bonus for your readers. So, I'll be going over a few of the strategies I can think of, and I'll discuss their relative advantages and disadvantages. To start with the easiest and probably the most obvious one, this is the trope also known as his name is Barkeep. Basically, what you're doing here is you address the character by whatever their role is in the story. So, if you saw my Mary Sue video, you would have seen that I called the Mary Sue throughout. That is basically the concept. If your character is the baker, you just call him the baker and be done with it. A pretty impressive execution of this is the cabbage merchant in Out of the Last Airbender. We didn't know the man's name until Legend of Korra, and even then, everyone still calls him the cabbage merchant because he's the cabbage merchant, right? It can be hard to pull this off with a main character, especially if you're writing something novel length. So, an exception that immediately springs to mind is Fight Club, but it can be done, but it's pretty difficult, at least without making the reader roll their eyes. So, it's an effective strategy because you're just writing the character in using basically a placeholder instead of going into the trouble of actually naming them. Another advantage is not having to worry about implications that a name might have. This is a pretty useful strategy for characters that have a very fixed and very limited role in the story. So, for example, the barkeep, essentially. If this strategy doesn't quite work for your character, then the next strategy is to use a real name. Honestly, we'll have few other alternatives if your story is actually set in the real world. So, this strategy can become a lot of research depending on what you're writing. In general, baby name sites are a good source of names. There are a lot of them, and they provide names with meanings with varying levels of accuracy. So you should be aware of that. And there are also surname databases that you can use to come up with a character's family name. Some of them have the meaning of the surname with it too. Another thing is most of these sites have grown wise to the writer market. So quite a few of them allow you to generate random names, and you can search by name origin or name meaning and so on. So you have a good place to start there. Though a word of caution, this is pretty alright if your characters are from the same place as you or from a culture that you're pretty familiar with. That way you're likely to pick up on, the various stereotypes attached to names or other meanings and so on. So think stuff like Karen. That's not always noted in their sites. Sometimes they mention it, but not always. With historical settings, don't take what the site tells you at face value. You might want to do a bit of research on the name yourself and verify its origin and whether it was tied to any particular group of people, for example. With names from other cultures, try to get some input from people from the culture you're writing about. A mistake quite a few writers tend to make is using names that fell out of fashion maybe half a century ago. So, this kind of feedback can help you catch that, notice which ones are old fashioned. Of course, you can pick ancient names for some characters. Some parents are history nerds, but slightly out of date is a little bit weirder. Or you can go with grandiose names for some as well. The problem is when this happens with every single character for no apparent reason. Again, though, that depends on whether you're going for realism. If you're not going for realism or if you're just obsessed with ancient names, go ahead and give everyone ancient names. Just make sure you're doing it on purpose. Whether you're being consistent with it or whether you're being inconsistent. Just make sure you do whatever you do on purpose, or everyone will see right through your sloppy research. Another thing you can do is to make up a sort of real sounding name. This has been done by writers historically, so there's nothing really wrong with it. A possible issue you will run into is similar identical sounding names with different meanings in different languages, or names whose meaning has drifted when it crossed from one language to another. For example, names that were male names in one language that became female names in another. But if it doesn't bother you, you don't have to worry about it. So, another thing, watch out how invested you become in any given name. You may spend days or weeks picking up the perfect name for your main character, writing half a book with that name, and then discovering a name that's suddenly better and deciding to rename your character and then doing that again and again and again. So, the thing to realize is you'll change with time too. So, Maybe what you value in a name now may not be what you value in a name 10 years later. So the perfect name you picked 2 years ago for your perfect main character may not sound so perfect anymore. You'll just have to get used to the reality that there is no objectively perfect name. So if you don't want to go with a real or real sounding name, the last option is to just make up a name. This is an option for some fantasy and sci-fi settings. Mainly, it's not limited to that, but that's where it sees the most application. One option is to, stitch random sounds that sound correct for the character somehow and call it a day. That might work, especially for a limited number of characters, but it might start becoming obvious pretty soon. Another option is you can go for a conlang. For this, though, you'll need to create a conlang first, and that can be a lot of work. The payoff, though, is a relatively consistent sound and names that sound like they belong in the setting, as in your names would sound like they could originate from the same language. Another plus is you can use the conlang to reflect what your characters or the society they live in value. So it could be strength, bravery, willpower, or being happy, intelligence, skill, or you could also use it to indicate social norms, for example. For example, do they just name girls after flowers? Are they afraid to give people grandiose names because they think it'll attract misfortune? Do they name people after gods? Do they view that as complete blasphemy? Or do they just name children in birth order? Those are things you can think about. And then when it comes to surnames, you could use it to indicate their place of origin or ancestral occupation. Or did they just pick the name out of a hat? Or is it something else entirely? So with real names, with whatever culture you pick, most of these are going to be sort of decided for you. So if you're going to go for something else, you will have a very limited pool of names to choose from. But if you're working with a conlang, well, you can basically do anything you want. Or I suppose you could do what Tolkien did with the hobbits by naming your characters in a conlang and then translating them back into Old English, as in finding Old English names that actually fit the intended meaning. So that makes sense because you're naming the characters through the lens of the setting. So you're using what that society values and then translating it into English, which means the sounds in the name are not entirely foreign to the reader and they can actually pronounce the names. So yeah, that's a pitfall I forgot to mention with conlang names. Just make sure your reader can at least guess how it's pronounced. So yeah. In conclusion, the strategy you use depends on your setting and the character in question. There are no right or wrong answers, so it's very much case by case depending on what you're writing and what your character is and how much time you want to put into it and all that. So that is it. See you next time.